This is easily the thing that trips people up the most when they're first getting started learning how to style their curls. I'm a Canadian curly-haired content creator, and my whole goal is to help you be a little less lonely trying to figure out your unique curly hair. If your hair is suddenly getting a little bit more tangled than usual or not holding curl as well as it used to, if it seems straw-like or super stretchy, but it's not bouncing back to its length, any of these things could be a sign that you're having an issue with protein moisture balance. If you're looking for a curl community to help you get to the curls of your dreams a little bit faster, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Protein moisture balance. What are we even talking about here? Protein refers to hair products that contain protein ingredients, which, yes, is one of the building blocks of what makes our curls nice and strong. On the other side, we have moisture, which refers to products that are more moisture heavy, and they're more about making sure your hair is nice and hydrated. When it comes to talking about protein moisture balance, we're not literally talking about either end of a seesaw. They aren't literally opposites. You can have too much or too little of both at the same time. However, we refer to them as protein moisture balance because often the remedy to an excess of one is by introducing more of the other and less of the first. Often the case. So because of that, we discuss it as a balance often, but they aren't literally opposites. You can have an excess of both. So you can have too much or too little protein. You can have too much or too little moisture. What does that look like? Basically, your hair won't be as healthy as it usually is, and you see slightly different symptoms depending on whether the excess or lack is protein or moisture. So let's dive right into recognizing the symptoms. If your hair is in protein overload, it's going to seem a little bit more straw-like than usual. You're probably gonna have more tangles, or you might even see fairy knots, those tiny, tiny little knots that only have a couple of hairs in them and you end up having to cut them out of your hair. So if you take a single hair strand and you pull on either side, it will probably break almost immediately. And of course, that's gonna lead to more breakage and shedding than usual, just like when you're brushing your hair and going about your daily life. Your curls probably also won't be as tight or bouncy as they once were. They might be falling a little bit limp. On the other hand, if you have an overload of moisture in your hair, you're gonna see very different symptoms. The only commonality between the two might be your curls will also be a little bit more limp than you're used to. They're not gonna be quite as bouncy, but instead of being straw-like, your hair is going to be overly soft. When dry, when wet, it might even be a bit mushy or gummy. If you don't know what I'm talking about, your hair probably hasn't been or isn't in moisture overload. Individual hair strands are going to be stretchier than usual. They might even stretch 30% of their original length or more before breaking, and they won't bounce back to their original length. They'll just kind of stretch and then break. Severe moisture overload is called hydral fatigue, but we're not gonna get too much into that for today. If any of these symptoms are starting to sound a little bit familiar, you're in good company. So many of us start taking care of our curly hair. We think we're doing all of the right things. Then suddenly products that used to work are no longer working, and we're starting to display some of the symptoms that we just talked about. If you are not familiar with moisture, protein, balance, this is going to completely blow your mind. You're gonna think you're doing everything right, and yet suddenly your hair is turning very unhealthy. Luckily, you found this video, and now you've probably been able to identify whether your hair is in protein overload or moisture overload based on the symptoms we just discussed. So what do you do about it? Let's start by talking about a case of protein overload. The first thing I'm gonna tell you to do is read your ingredient labels on all of the products that you're using. That means turning it around and actually going through those words that you think you can't even pronounce. I'm gonna put up on the screen here a list of some of the most common protein ingredients, and you are going to be looking through all of your products to see which ones contain protein and which ones don't. We're gonna pay particular attention to those products that have protein listed in the first 5 or so ingredients, because that's gonna mean it's a prominent ingredient in the product. Now, don't worry, you don't need to cut these ingredients out for the rest of your life. You don't need to throw away these products. But what I want you to start by doing is going and grabbing a Sharpie and writing the word protein. On all of those moving forward, you will be able to easily identify which of your products contain protein and which don't, or at least which have a lot less. For the next 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how long your hair has been going into protein overload and how severe your case of protein overload is. You're gonna eliminate those products until you start to see a change in your hair. One time my hair went into protein overload and it took me 6 weeks to recover because I didn't recognize the signs and I kept using protein. The second time I went into protein overload, I noticed on the first wash day and I was able to turn it around in 1 or 2 wash days. So the more comfortable you get with recognizing the signs, the quicker you're gonna be able to get back to a healthy state of hair. Now that we know which protein heavy ingredients to cut out, we're going to clarify our hair. Now I've talked about this before, but if you're new to this channel, clarifying means using a shampoo that will actually be able to strip away any buildup on top of your hair strands. So your regular no poo or low poo shampoos in this scenario is not quite gonna cut it. If you're on a bit of a budget, you can use whatever drugstore sulfate shampoo that you have. However, I highly recommend going out and purchasing a gentle clarifying shampoo for your hair, something like Bounce Curl Gentle Clarifying Shampoo or Kinky Curly Come Clean. Those are both clarifying shampoos that will help you strip away all of that protein that's been building up and is causing all of the symptoms that we don't love right now. The next thing we're gonna do is do a deep conditioning or hair mask. Now be careful here that you're not using a protein mask on your hair. Read the ingredient label. Some of the deep conditioners that I love that have no added protein are the Lust Brands Deep Condition and Renew Deep Conditioning Mask, and also TGIN Honey Miracle Hair Mask. I'll link them both in the comments. Both great deep conditioning masks that have helped me personally get out of protein overload in the past. Coconut oil is not technically protein. However, some curly folks do find that using products that have coconut oil in them or are quite coconut oil heavy, that this can somehow make their protein overload worse. I'm not gonna debate the science of it. I know technically there's no protein in coconut oil. However, in my lived experience, coconut oil does make my protein overload worse. So that is also something I avoid when I'm in protein overload. Experiment and see for yourself whether or not this is an issue for you. Finally, if your hair is in protein overload, you likely are having more split ends due to all the breakage. It's time to go get a really good trim. And this is another thing that will help you get out of protein overload a lot faster in my experience and back to nice healthy curls. What about if you have moisture overload? We discussed those symptoms. If you're starting to see those in your hair, you're at the other end of the spectrum. And here are a few things that you can do to help make sure you don't go any further down that path. Obviously, slow down on using very rich or moisture heavy products. Cut out deep conditioning for a short period of time. Some people find the liquid oil cream method to be very effective, where they add oil to their hair before they go in with any of their more moisturizing hair products like curl cream. Avoid over shampooing your hair, which is going to remove the sebum or natural hair oil from your hair, which does create a protective coating. Just like with protein overload, you're going to want to trim your hair regularly to make sure you're removing any damage before it causes a larger issue. You can also use something like a coconut oil or really any pre-poo treatment that will help protect your strands while you're shampooing and make sure you're not pulling away too much of that natural hair oil or sebum that will then later protect your hair from becoming over moisturized. In the same way that with protein overload, we want to cut out protein for a period of time. When it comes to moisture overload, it can also be helpful to introduce some protein products to your product lineup if you haven't already, and this will help strengthen those hair strands. While it's pretty straightforward to identify products that contain protein if you have a list of protein ingredients, it's not quite so straightforward when it comes to moisture because it's almost impossible to avoid curly hair products that contain moisture-loving ingredients. That's just the nature of most curly hair products. So you don't need to stop using moisture-loving products entirely. What I would cut back on are some of the richer, heavier products and deep conditioning. If you have had protein overload or moisture overload in the past and you know some products that helped you get out of that, please please, for the sake of the entire curly hair community, drop those in the comments. It helps all of us when we know what has worked for other people in the past. And if you watched this video and suddenly realized you have some of these symptoms, please let me know and I'll try and help you in the comments as well. Follow me on TikTok for quick and easy curly hair tips, and follow me on Instagram. Every Saturday I give a $0 curly hair tip because curly hair doesn't have to be expensive. Hit that follow to find your curl community because, you know, this whole curly hair thing doesn't have to be quite so lonely.